My friends, the following are the final essential terms in order to understand the historical Paul and his project. Once more, we're not talking about the Paul as he is theologized and romanticized, praised or debased today by so many Christians and other people, but how he actually was. Without understanding these terms properly, Paul is simply inaccessible to you. Misunderstanding and distortion inescapably result. Therefore, in order to read Paul respectfully, let's go over these terms. The law, or Torah. The law, or Torah, is a fluid concept in the writings of Paul. It can designate the entire Old Testament, or the sections called the Law and the Prophets, or more specifically, the Law of Moses. Or the Decalogue, or 10 Commandments. As used by Paul, the law can mean all written law. Justice. In the writings of Paul and everywhere else in the New Testament world, justice means proper interpersonal relations. It relates very closely to justification. In the writings of Paul, justification is the process by which Israelite Jesus Group clients become acceptable to God by reason of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Among New Testament thinkers, Paul thought that because of Jesus' redemptive death, God waived God's right to avenge the dishonor done to God by those who sinned against God. That is, who shamed or dishonored the God of Israel. As we have seen repeatedly in various Bible Alive presentations, there is no evidence that Paul was interested in non-Israelites. Therefore, when Paul writes that a person is justified, he is referring, of course, to Israelites, not all human beings everywhere. Despite what later Christian theologians have mutated Paul into, namely a universalist, the historical Paul was an ethnocentric particularist. And for him, justification is not really a central theme, although it is a central concern in his defense of his gospel of God to the Galatian Jesus Group people, or Messianists. The Greek word translated justice or righteousness is also translated justification, piety, and even religion. This Greek word covers a considerable range of meanings when used in Hellenistic philosophy. However, in first century Israelite in-group usage, the word was considered a defining characteristic of Israelites by nature, really by custom, a quality that made Israelites to be who they are. Perhaps the closest English equivalent to this usage of this Greek word is acceptability, specifically divine acceptability, being acceptable to the God of Israel. In other words, from an Israelite in-group perspective, what was it that made Israelites unique among human beings? For Paul and other Israelites, it was divine acceptability, having been chosen by the God of Israel. And how was this acceptable condition maintained? For many Israelites, such as the Pharisees, the answer would be through observance of the directives of the patron God of Israel, the Torah or law. To be justified by law meant to be acceptable to the God of Israel by obeying God's directives. Paul, the Israelite, opposed this position by insisting that justification comes through faith. That is, an Israelite becomes acceptable to the God of Israel by showing trust and Mediterranean Godfather-style loyalty to God, who raised Jesus from the dead. Please understand that for Paul, faith does not mean belief. Faith is like loyalty to your Don in the Godfather movies. That's what it means to Paul and other New Testament authors. In Paul's view, while God's Torah is very good, Torah observance alone is insufficient to maintain divine acceptability. Redemption. In the authentic writings of Paul, redemption means the restoration of an Israelite's status before the patron God of Israelites. Generally speaking, redemption means the restoration of family honor or group honor. And according to Paul, it is this honor that Jesus restores through his dying for Israelites and thus allaying the threat of God's just wrath. So Paul thought that Jesus' death, his hyper-ethno-masculine death, his honoring God through taking such a shameful death manfully, accomplished Israelite redemption. And therefore Paul thought that God willed Jesus' death. But other New Testament Jesus groups disagreed with Paul. Righteousness. Throughout the New Testament and in Paul's 7 authentic writings, righteousness means acceptance by the God of Israel. For Paul, righteousness is rooted in Abraham, who believed in what God did and was loyal to God, not in Torah observance, but in God. The divine acceptance that is righteousness means the privileged social identity of being a Jesus group member, and therefore an Israelite in the truest sense. The norms associated with righteousness defined proper interpersonal relationships between humans and God, as well as between humans themselves. According to Paul, Jesus demonstrated such righteousness on Israelite behalf in his hyper-ethno-masculine, honorable surrender to shameful death on a cross. Salvation. Salvation for Paul is being protected from God's wrath that Paul thinks will be made manifest very soon. Not in our lifetimes, thousands of years later, but in his lifetime, when Paul was absolutely sure that Israelite theocracy would be established. Folks, Paul does not really talk about hell, or being saved from hell, or some afterlife disaster when he's talking about salvation. That's not what salvation meant for Paul. Wrath, of course, is Paul's usual way of referring to God's defending God's honor taking satisfaction on those who shame God. Remember, all theology or God talk is analogy. And all analogy is rooted in human experience. And all human experience is culturally specific. So when ancient Mediterranean Israelites thought about God and talked about God, the words they used, the expressions they used, the descriptions they tried to grapple to come up with, those were all taken from anthropomorphic, anthropopathic, culturally specific to Middle East and Mediterranean analogies. And the analogy that came up was a Mediterranean patron, like the Godfather. That's how they saw God, a great patron. And what would happen if the beneficiary of the patron, the client of the patron, who has been kinified, has been made into a child and heir through the act of Mediterranean patronage, what if he were to disrespect the reputation, the honor of his patron? Then his patron would have to defend his honor. That's what wrath is in the Bible. So, for Paul, wrath of God is God defending God's honor by taking satisfaction on those who shame God. Those who shame God or dishonor God are sinners. That's what sinning is in the Bible, to shame God. Specifically, sinners are Israelite sinners. Since only Israelites have a covenant with the God of Israel, since only Israelites are obliged to defend this God's honor, and since only Israelites are obligated to serve this God, well, it is the Israelites shaming their God that required the satisfaction entailed in wrath. Now, the salvation that Jesus Group members have obtained through the cosmic Lord Jesus Christ isn't escape from hell or some awful afterlife place, but rather to their rescue from God's present wrath. Although these Israelites have dishonored God, thanks to the Israelite Jesus' manfully honorable death for them, Paul thought that Jesus Group Israelites shall avoid the requirements of satisfaction. Their honor debt was waived by God, so impressed God was by Jesus' honoring God. And that's translated as forgiveness, which is really the canceling of the honor debt. God canceled the honor debt of the Jesus Group Israelites because of their loyalty in Jesus' loyalty. That means God waived God's right to due satisfaction or revenge. So Paul thought that any day now during his lifetime, Messiah Jesus was coming to establish the Israelite theocracy in the land of Israel, and that would cause a cosmic upheaval of terrible violence. That is the wrath of God. God sends his army of sky servants, his angels, led by Jesus Messiah, and they destroy the present order in the land of Israel to establish the new order. That's the wrath. And that was going to happen, according to Paul, in his lifetime. And Jesus Group people, in loyalty with Jesus' loyalty, we translate that as faith. It's the faith of Jesus that saves. Not the beliefs of the followers of Jesus, but Jesus' faith, his Godfather-style loyalty. So according to Paul, Jesus Group people who are united to Jesus' loyalty won't be harmed by God due to God's waiving God's own rights to revenge. Folks, Paul was not talking about the afterlife.